I just want to stay and start off the podcast with saying that all you in the audience are some real motherfuckers right now because we got Ash calling the cops on us. First off, that's anti-communist. I don't want to hear it. What is with this? Talk to the manager. I'm the manager, Andrew. We all know this. The only one who's doing good here is Chico. Hello, Cheeks. Nice to see you around here. Remember to hit the thumbs up. That's what our producer Janet Lumpy Luis demands of all of you. Wow, 2 seconds in and I'm on so blessed. Yeah, you are because you're coming in here and you're causing problems.
You came in hot.
But Cutie will come and get you. Cutie is gonna come and get you. He's the head of the NKVD. He will call the police on the police. Anyway,
Cutie is the police.
I cannot be surprised, right? Because there's a lot of Latin energy going on right here in this podcast, more so than I think we've ever had. And y'all are talking about calling the police, so I'm peeping it. I'm writing it down, I'm jotting it down. You're all on the list. I will end this live right now. It will be the shortest episode we've ever had.
This is everyone's files now have an addendum.
I have documents on all of you. Anyway, no, just kidding, of course. Anyway, how's everybody doing? We have a special guest here today. If I can remember how to pronounce her name, I'm pretty sure they said Omai.
Omai, yeah.
Oh, I'd say, oh God, I can't even. God damn.
Immediately.
Immediately. It's funny because the episode I just pre-recorded the other day, the person had delusional in their name, but they didn't spell it the way it's spelled. So I was just looking at it. Cruz, you're gonna have to figure this issue out. They didn't spell it the way it's supposed to. So I stuttered my whole way through it, and I'm just like, man, why did Kollectiv make the dyslexic guy the podcaster? I'll never figure that one out. But anyway, here we are. What's going on? How are you?
I'm doing good. I'm in midterms right now, so I'm suffering a little, but otherwise we're getting through it.
And I heard you said it was your second degree. So that sounds preposterous to me, not for you, but for me, because I did not like school very much. So to do it again, no, I'm not about it. So kudos to you. What are you studying right now?
I'm a political science and sociology double major. And I already have my first degree in sociology. I love school, but I don't love the educational institution. So
yeah, I think I can relate to that for sure, because I went to nursing school and I learned a lot, but the actual process of going to school, I hated. I absolutely hated it. I hated the bureaucracy, the unnecessary rules. It was just a bunch of nonsense. Because you need to be repping us dyslexics. All right, that's sweet of you. And Ivan is next, of course. Anyway, yeah. So, like Emily said, we have invited you on so you can info dump to us, and we're all pretty excited about that. So, from what I've seen from your content, you speak a lot on Latin Mexican issues with a socialist perspective, a communist perspective, and I think that's really interesting to get into. And sort of, what is your analysis, of I would say where Mexico's been, where it's been, where it's at now, where you think it's going. I think that would be really cool to get into. I saw through a lot of your notes, you talk a lot about AMLO and the Monedra party. And I don't know, I think it'd be really interesting perspective, because I think a lot of communists still, they have the idea that, they still have this idea that Mexico is the U.S. with a yellow filter on it, So I think, your ability to kind of highlight to us a little bit more of what's going on, only a few miles away for some people.
Well, I think I have a lot to say, particularly about the perception of Mexican politics in the United States. I think a lot of Americans, especially even Mexican Americans, have internalized this idea that Mexican politics are in any way similar to American politics. So, for example, somebody just commented on my live previously that Mexico is a settler colony. That is objectively, socially, politically, legally not true. Mexico is largely comprised of indigenous populations, and in fact, it boasts one of the highest indigenous populations in all of the American continents, both of them. So there's just a huge population of indigenous people, and so even the application of indigenous politics from North America to the indigenous population of Mexico simply do not apply. They're not similar in that sense, but also the Mexican politic itself was heavily suppressed by the United States for the greater part of 100 years. And this is before the Morena Party came into power. And I think one of the reasons that Americans don't know in particular what's happening in Mexico is because if we looked to our neighbors and we understood what they went through, we would be doing what they're doing. And what I mean by that is that the Morena Party is an explicitly anti-neoliberal government. They are Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, the former president of Mexico, he refers to neoliberalism as a calamity and a catastrophe on human life. And he doesn't refer to himself as a communist because both the center and right-wing parties of Mexico would have a very reactionary response to that. But instead, he refers to the Mexican social infrastructure as the fourth transformation. He also calls it the conscious revolution, or Mexican humanism. So for him, communism is this idea that is sort of the prehistory of Marxist communism. So and a lot of people don't know this, but Marx based primitive communism on Mesoamerican cultures. So the AMLO's position on communism is heavily centered on indigeneity and what communism looked like before pre-Hispanic, pre-colonial ideologies. And in fact, he himself was sort of groomed by the Chontales, which is his tribe, and raised to sort of inculcate socialist policy inside of the general Mexican politic. Now, we can say a lot about hierarchy and how it's inherently abusive in Mexico, and we could say that they still have a great path to move even further left that is left. But in terms of how we observe Mexican politics in comparison to the American politics, I think a lot of people think that it is actually Mexico with the yellow filter and America with the yellow filter. And I think that's a really adept way that most Westerners perceive the Mexican politic when it couldn't be further from the truth. And the people that have died, even in this year alone, this last political season alone, for Mexican policy to continue on its left-wing path has been astronomical. It was one of the bloodiest years in Mexican politics there ever has been. And this is largely because the United States is actively interfering in Mexican politics and ensuring that really leftist politicians don't make it as far as they're supposed to. So, yeah, I have a lot to say about that in particular. But yeah, I think that's a really good way to characterize it, is that particularly Americans view Mexican policy and Mexican people and just the general region as a second America, as a colony of the United States in many ways.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. I used to work with an indigenous group of communists who are working on sort of revitalizing the Chicanismo within what was, formerly Mexico, taken over by the United States. And I was working on with an old buddy, an old friend of the show, on sort of like what we were perceiving as like kind of like a new iteration of like Chicanismo, in the sense of like recognizing, I was sort of working on my own idea. I don't want to say my own theory because that sounds cringe, but my own idea of like basically the marginalized identities of, what we call Hispanic, in our case, indigenous people of the, South and Central America, sort of uniting under like the same marginalization that we face as we're imported into the empire, and kind of building that around the idea of Chicanismo. It never didn't go anywhere, so that would be something I'd have to revisit if I would still even agree with that at this point. But the point I'm making is that a lot of the resistance that we had encountered were people saying that that the comments distracted me. People saying that that Mexico is a settler colony, and therefore there is no real legitimacy in like basically what you're saying,
in the Mexican politics.
Yeah. And I never agree with that. That would be fair to say that, well, they're a settler colony in the same expanse as like the United States.
Yeah, well, beyond referring to it as a settler colony, we have to look at the definitions of what settlers are, what colonists are, and what settler colonialism is as a whole. Mexico is a sovereign nation. It is not under the colonial rule or impetus of the United States or Britain or Spain anymore. We could say that Nueva España was a settler colony. We can say that Mexican people in Mexico have internalized a lot of colonialist ideology. We can say that there has been a whitewashing that's happened to the general Mexican public, especially the Mexican American public who have come here and have assimilated. But we can't say that Mexico is a settler colony when it boasts that high indigenous population, and it absolutely displays in the culture. Another issue that I take is that people characterize mestizaje as a settler colonist ideology or a settler colonist identity, when in fact the indigenous populations of Mexico do not view mestizos that way. They view them as their own people. And to exclude mestizos from the indigenous identity is actually to participate in cultural genocide, because mestizaje, right? So mestizaje in and of itself, there's a word for it in English, which is miscegenation. Miscegenation is a forced reproductive product, right? So people who are mestizos are coerced into that identity of no fault of their own, right? It has this, it's a coercive identity. It's an identity that was absolutely applied to all of the Latino community or the Hispanic communities that were literally subject to a genocide. So to divorce mixed people from their indigenous population, it would be like saying any other ethnic group, like any other marginalized ethnic group, is no longer a part of their original community for being mixed by force, which is ridiculous. And if you right, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I would get into these arguments and these debates with people that, you know, my whole reason for existing is because colonialism and genocide and R word happened, right? Because I'm a mestizo. I'm by definition, I'm mixed between indigenous populations and white settlers. So to say that I am not indigenous because of what had happened previous to me existing doesn't make any sense. And I think a lot of the misconception would come from like the idea that as if I were sort of trying to come in to like the North, you know, what we consider North America, or not just North America, but like the continental United States and, you know, current tribes that that still exist and live there, that I was sort of like coming in and being like, I'm one of you guys. And I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I am removed from my indigeneity by so many steps because of colonization. But I do have, for lack of a better term, the proof that like that's where I come from. So you can't just say that I'm not that, because of that's literally the whole reason why I'm here. You know what I mean? Right. Yeah, but it's definitely erasure. But like, so I'm from Guatemala, and like in Guatemala, yeah, there's still a lot of white supremacist, you know, thought and ideology that comes from colonialism. But people who look more like me, you know, they say, you know, more white passing Guatemalans who discriminate against, you know, mestizos and more, you know, indigenous people or indigenous presenting people, you know, they would call them Indios or, you know, all kinds of things, or, you know, blatantly attack them, or, you know, in like the dating scene, be like, you shouldn't be with, you know, the people who look more native. Like, so if that discrimination is happening down there, just because I ended up on this side doesn't mean that I'm not still indigenous, you know? So it's a whole erasure is what I'm trying to say.
Well, yeah, it's actually saying that mestizos are not indigenous is participating in mestizaje, because that is literally what the caste system was for. It was to intentionally stratify. It was to intentionally stratify mestizos from their cultural identity. To say this, to say that mestizos are not indigenous in any capacity, is actually participating in cultural genocide. It is actually truly participating in cultural genocide. Can you imagine if this was said about North American indigenous people who are native to this particular side of the border? It would be ridiculous. Nobody would accept it. They would reject it. Yeah. But there is also an imperial racism that's at play here that is contextualizing the way that indigenous people in Mexico and in Central and South America are being perceived. So I think there's something to be said about how there's just these norms that are being applied in very sort of asymmetrical ways. And as such, people are obviously going to feel alienated from their culture, and they're not going to look any further because they're like, oh, I'm a colonist, I'm an imposter in my own culture, and that is ridiculous. People should be encouraged to reconnect to their roots. They should be encouraged to revitalize their land, their culture, their people. You should be encouraged. You should not ever feel like you are separate from your people. You are your people.
Yeah, exactly. It started to really occur to me when I would start filling out government forms and stuff, and they would be like, what is your, what's your ethnicity? It'd be, what are my options? Hispanic. And then it's like, what is your race? And it's like, well, I'm not white and I'm not black and I'm not Asian. So my only other option is Pacific Islander indigenous. And I don't remember where I heard this story from. It was either somebody on the podcast or it was another show I was watching. I think it was another show I was watching. And it was basically the scenario was a bunch of school children, Hispanic, children were in a class and they were supposed to fill out forms to graduate. And when they got to the same exact situation I was saying, and they were asking the teacher, like, what do we put down? And the teacher was like, put down that you're Hispanic and that you're white. And it became very like apparent when they were like, what, but we're not, like, we don't, like, we're just not that, like, we didn't grow up that way. We're not seen as that. So, I've had a very, very, similar experience, in recent years being like, yeah, no, I'm not white. Not that I ever claimed to be, but like, it's just become more and more apparent that I'm like, oh yeah, I am this person. And Nico actually just pointed out it was our friend Nebula who's been on the show. So yeah, that was actually our podcast that we were talking about this. If you're interested, we did a whole episode. It was that podcast that was cooking. We did an episode on being a first generation communist. So yeah, Nebula was telling a story. So shout out Nebula. Hope you're well. Anyway, so let's kind of get a little bit more on track here. So we talked about a little bit, touched on AMLO a little bit, touched on the Morena party. So can you tell people who don't know, does Morena as like an acronym stand for anything? And is AMLO, with not calling themselves a communist, are they just playing 5D chess, or are they sort of coming in with a new like synthesis in a way? What is your thing? What are your thoughts on that?
So the Morena party is a syllabic abbreviation. It stands for Movement, Regenerational Movements Organization, I think. I don't remember the exact acronym, but it's basically this syllabic abbreviation, and in English it translates to brown people.
Nice.
Like Morena, like Moreno, but brown people.
Let's
in
go.
Context. Yes, yeah. So that's very intentional. Even though he himself is very light-skinned, I will say. So I want to talk a little bit more about the founding of the party so that we can kind of get into how AMLO is playing this. So the founding of the party, and if you read my paper, there's a lot to this, but the gist of it is that Andrés Manuel López Obrador, he started his career as a not politician. He was largely looking to become into education, and that's why he did teach sociology for a period of time. And he started his career after he was associated with this, or he realized that there was this massive federal movement to oppress the students who were resisting American imperialism and the Porril movement. And if you don't know about the Porril movement, they were literally fascist federalist unions. So they were unions inside of the government that were explicitly fascist, and their whole purpose was to oppress communist and left-wing ideology inside of student movements. And they killed, I think it was like 136 people during the first attack in the 1960s. And this happened at UNAM, which is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, his university. And so as he came up in politics, he sort of faced all of this resistance to decolonization, to to leftist ideology in general. And he has a sociology background, so he very much fully understands what is happening. And because he understands what's happening, he starts making these very intelligent moves to sort of align himself with what we would consider the Democratic Party, which is the PRI in Mexico. And both the PRI and the PAN are both essentially what we could say are the Democratic and Republican Party, just like in Mexican font. Like they really are very, very right-wing political parties. And so as he's going through the notions of aligning himself with these parties to be able to generate a new third party, he starts an NGO. And this nonprofit organization essentially is heavily centered on infusing the Mexican politic with socialist ideology. Now, he doesn't say this explicitly, and one of the main reasons for this is because at this time, Mexico is still very westernized, still has a lot of American influence in its politic, and there are a lot of literal American collaborative politicians who would not just resist it, would actually actively put down his organization. So he starts fundraising through the indigenous population that he is raised by, which is the Chontales. And he helps them do an agricultural step to revitalize the swamps that are nearby. And they are able to create essentially this very, very harmonious agricultural setup on these swamps. And as a result, he gets this mass support from the indigenous populations of his land, and not just the Chontales, like a bunch of other indigenous populations join them and help him come up into power. And as he's doing this, he's facing a lot of resistance to the point where at least 3 of the elections that we know of have explicit fraud that, like, the United States is interfering in, that pro-American politicians are interfering in, and just like general Western influences are interfering in. And he loses both his gubernatorial races for the Mexico City, which is like the biggest. It would kind of be like losing the Washington D.C. government like position. And he loses, and then finally on his third try he wins. But despite the fact that he wins, he still has to basically get like 60,000 people to come protest just to certify the election, and they're in defiance of the version of the electoral college that Mexico has. He still manages to be seated as the governor of Mexico City, and at that point he codifies the Morena party into the Mexican politic. That's like when it gets its inception. And he does run for president 2 times before he finally makes it into the seat. Again, lots of interference and such. And then he finally, at the very end, makes it as president, and that's in 2016. So he's making all these moves, and he's facing resistance basically at every corner. And at the same time, many politicians who join his his cohort of politicians who are going to be couched under the Morena party, many of them start getting methodically assassinated. And as they are getting methodically assassinated, he sort of starts to realize that he has to change the way that he's talking about Mexican politics to be able to ensure that the third party, it survives. And so he does. And he starts referring to it as Mexican humanism, which are nods to pre-Hispanic, pre-colonial roots of Marxist ideology. He cites Antonio Gramsci through his works, and he has his own papers that he wrote about sociology and the inception of Mexico and the context of neoliberalism and how it was applied to Mexico without its consent. And he's just doing all these different moves that specifically are resisting the American empire. And a lot of people die as a result because they're trying to maintain their integrity. And yet still he makes it. And so now his primary message, I would say, is about socialism, but with a Mexican perspective rather than a Western perspective, because in many ways he's also trying to distance himself from Western ideology as a whole, right? So like in a broader way, he's very worried about the implementation of Mexican American politicians in the Mexican politic who are bad actors, who want to destroy the Morena party. And as I stated before, this was one of the deadliest years for Mexican politicians, particularly Morena party. 60% of the politicians that were assassinated within this last political season in Mexico were all Morena party politicians. And they were espousing anti-American, anti-imperial, and pro-socialist ideology. And when I say socialist, I mean, like, he's not calling it socialism, but they're nationalizing resources. They're codifying social infrastructure. They're creating more and more human rights in Mexico that include people who are refugees, migrants, just like generally people from all over the world. And so I think it's really interesting because I don't think that he's necessarily playing 3D chess. I think he's doing things in a way that makes sense for Mexican people and that doesn't necessarily make sense for American or Western communists. Because when we see this, our natural reaction is to immediately point the finger and say that they're corrupt. But it couldn't be further from the truth, because corruption has social implications and it has actual real world outcomes, right? So if you see corruption, it's going to have an outcome. Like here in the United States, we know that we're run by oligarchs because everything is crazy expensive. Sorry, wildly expensive. And it's just our human rights are being like methodically brought down one by one.
Yeah.
And we also see that our politicians generally are not moving in any meaningful way to codify any laws that benefit us.
Right.
And that is how it's been for so long, that for a lot of us, it really it seems kind of like the norm. But in Mexico, we're seeing constant codification of human rights, constant implementation of social infrastructure and social programs. Just literally like last week, they created a new vivienda law, which is like a housing law to ensure that Mexican people have housing as a human right. And the way that they're doing this is that they're doing tax credits and making housing essentially free for people who are impoverished. So it's a very interesting thing to watch Mexican people get all the things that Americans are asking for, and then simultaneously Americans are voting for politicians who have literally zero interest in helping them. So so I would say that it's not that he's necessarily not calling it communism because of a sort of political ploy or our sensibilities. It's more that he was using language that Mexican people understood to be able to understand. Like, so he's not going to say socialism or communism. He's going to say social programs that you want, and these are the social programs that you want. And you're
right. No, I understand what you're saying, and I think it's a really interesting way to put it, because I'm definitely somebody at this point where like, well, you said you've watched my content, so like you've definitely heard me be like, I'm an authoritarian tanky. So like I'm a lot more like like just put it out as it is. But it's not my place to tell Mexico or Mexicans how they should call or operate their, political ideology, even if it is in favor of what I'm advocating for in the heart of the empire. You know what I mean? So, I'm definitely going to sit and think with that, because if it works for them, it works for them. It reminds me, I know this for a lot of people, it has negative connotations. So just listen to what I'm saying for a sec. Like, it reminds me of the idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics, but like without all the, blatant, appeals to capitalism. You know what I mean? But like that, but like for real, basically. So yeah, no, that's really interesting to think about and see. We always hear in the States that how horrible and terrible, Mexico and Latin America is. And I hear it all the time here in New York, especially because, so many people immigrate or seek asylum, and they come here in New York. And we hear all the, people are always like, they're coming here and taking the jobs and stealing up all the resources and money and whatever. But, when you start to break down these conversations with people, and a lot of times, not the immigrants, like just people, talking shit basically. And when you break it down with them, you start speaking to them. A lot of times what they say is like, oh, well, people are fleeing because of corruption. And for sure, there is a lot of corruption, but corruption doesn't, just like anything, it doesn't come from nothing. There's a reason why things happen. Everything is based in material reality, right? So like when they're talking about corruption, really what they're just talking about is capitalism that is, I guess, a lot more overt in its supremacy, as opposed to the States, where the masses are kept very docile in sort of their submission to capital, their submission to the oligarchs and such. The reason why you don't see so many journalists in the States being blown up, even though that does happen, but not as blatantly, is because so many of the mainstream journalists are already in line with the capitalist establishment, as you may see in other places like Mexico, where there's a lot more active resistance happening in the mainstream. So I don't know. I think thanks for that info dump. You said a lot, but it was really cool so far.
That was wonderful.
To hear what you have to say. Let's look at the comments real quick. Shouldn't it be any surprise the Warhawks in the U.S. are talking about invading Mexico? Then no, yeah, EQD, and that makes sense. He's our other co-host, by the way. Because this situation you're painting for us reminds me a lot of when the Scandinavian nations began to move towards more social democracy after the establishment of the USSR, because they knew, oh shit, there's this giant country next to us that is doing the whole Marxism communism thing. If we don't start giving concessions now, we're next. Like either our people are going to rise up, or they're going to call for secession or even annexation. The United States can't afford a communist, Marxist, socialist, Mexican socialist movement on their borders, because then people here are going to start seeing like, oh, there's a lot of good stuff going on there. And even worse for the capitalists here would be a reverse brain drain situation where you have nurses, doctors, teachers, welders, even just, manual laborers being like, you know what, actually, let's go back. We're going back because they're going to give us jobs and houses and stuff.
Oh,
I mean, just look at like what, how we talk about Cuba, or how the United States talks about Cuba. Having a Marxist project so close it's a great threat, even if it's a small island.
Speaking of, Mexico just codified additional protections for Cubans and sending them more agricultural resources to basically defy the American empire. And the United States is having a whole tantrum about that. And that is that's very recent news. Also, I just found out, I think yesterday, that North Korea and Mexico are each other's biggest agricultural trading partners. I thought that was pretty interesting, and I just wanted to put that out there. Because I think the characterization of North Korea in the West, and particularly in the United States, is really, 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 really oppressive. But I don't really think that lands for a lot of Mexican people in Mexico, because that is not the relationship that they have with North Korea. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that a lot of that has to do with Americans' inability to process and recognize what it means to fight in revolutionary struggle. And I should clarify, I mean white liberal Americans, the ones who have the majority of the voice here. Because, we are taught here, I made a video about this, we were taught here, that basically North Korea or the DPRK just appeared out of nowhere. Stalin gave them a bunch of guns and told them to go bananas. We both know that that's not the case. We both know it's a lot more sophisticated than that. It was a movement that had started even before World War II, right? And that the subjugation and the annexation of South Korea by the United States, I don't mean literal annexation, but the subjugation of South Korea is all an artificial sort of situation, right? So
I would say it was pretty literally annexed.
That's fair. I just mean like in terms of it's not on the flag. You know what I mean? It's for sure a puppet, like 100%. But the way that neocolonialism works is they're territories or they're strategic allies. But like really, South Korea, Japan, they're us in a lot of ways. But anyway,
they
don't put it on like the jerseys or anything. Right. Keep it sacred.
But the point I'm making here is that like the Koreans in the DPRK, pretty recent history, had to fight their revolution, fight for their independence and their success. And Mexico has gone through many iterations of that in itself. And the United States' only real relationship when it comes to a major change in the status quo in terms of like the literal power structure was the bourgeois revolution of 1776. Well, then there was another, proto revolution between, the contradictions between the Union and the Confederacy. But ultimately, the modes of production, those who stayed in power didn't really change. So white liberals here in the States are very much used to this idea that like violence is icky. It's out there. We don't do that. If you just vote, like everything will change. But like, it's a lot more complicated than that, as you know.
Yeah. Something that I think one of the biggest phobias that the United States has is that the general public is going to figure out that Mexico just codified African rights, Black rights in Mexico as a sovereign group. meaning like they literally made them a group that has the same protections as the Mexican indigenous population. Beyond reparations, because Mexico obviously didn't participate in Black slavery, but beyond reparations, they're taking accountability for the social inequality at base level. So we're seeing they were classed as a vulnerable population as well, which means that they get access to social resources well before any of the other populations do, with exception of indigenous populations. And so I would say that if Black Americans all knew that, that would have very serious ramifications for the United States. So I think there has to be like a mass amount of propaganda turned out against Mexico, because when it comes to like realizing what is happening next door, and how Mexico is contextualized in the context of the United States, I'd have to plug this book real quick, South to Freedom. It's a book particularly about how Mexican people helped essentially have an informal underground railroad to help enslaved people run away. And this is just like the moral identity of Mexican people. It's not even just like something that was like formally arranged. It was just like people were like, hey, slavery is actually wrong. And I think the context of how the United States perceives Mexico it's definitely a threat to its hegemony. Like absolutely.
Mm-hmm. South to Freedom, Runaway Slaves to Mexico, and the Road to Civil War. Brilliant and surprising account of the coming of the American Civil War, showing the crucial role of slaves who escaped to Mexico. Underground railroads to the north promised salvation to many American slaves before the Civil War, but thousands of people in the South Central United States escaped slavery, not by heading north, but by crossing the southern border into Mexico, where slavery was abolished in 1837. Cool. Thanks for that plug. Really
it's a good one.
Made me proud. That to my list.
Mm-hmm.
Literally wept openly in class while reading it. It's such a good read.
All right, I'll let you know. I'll hit you up crying and be like, I get it.
Just come on the podcast again. Just start sobbing together.
Yeah.
Hey, like something about love and community and crying together. It's good. It's good for the soul.
It's healing.
Oh, for sure. So tell me how, I saw in your notes, you mentioned how you saw the Moneda party like directly affect, I think you said, your father's side of your family. Can you tell us about that? Like a little bit more of like the I guess, I mean, obviously go as personal as you want, but like the personal aspects of this, because we're speaking a lot of facts and like matter of fact, but like how has this been presented to you in your life?
So I say this all the time, and people take this negatively or positively depending on who's in the room. But I live half of the year in Mexico in my tribe. We are Huixárica, and my home is still made out of adobe. It's there's a stamp on it that says the year that it was handmade by my great-great-grandparents, and it was made in 1837. So my home is very old. We still have indigenous architecture and carvings throughout our land, and we own 10 properties of approximately 100 acres each. So I'm like a completely wild person when I'm not in the United States. And obviously the biggest cartel in my neck of the woods is the Cartel Nueva Generación de Jalisco. Or Jalisco Nueva Generación. I don't remember what the order of the words is. But anyway, they are a cartel that is especially known for brutalizing the indigenous populations and sequestering their land and turning it into production facilities, essentially, whether that is for manufacturing or distribution, or actually just like agricultural theft. Or using their agricultural resources to export drugs to the United States. So, and right next door is the Driscoll agricultural plant, right, really, really close to my house. So my political view of Driscoll is that it's obviously an inherently colonial agricultural business, in particular because it takes resources that are typically free. And so in my little pueblito, anybody can go, and we get backpackers all the time. and my grandparents would host them in our house at no cost. They could just come, and even if you don't speak any English or any Spanish, I mean, or any of the languages that are available to speak, you'll get fed. You're gonna have somewhere to sleep, and you can just walk on the land and go and eat the food. So for me, before the Morena party, my experience was that I was really, really afraid to go back. I was really, really afraid to go back anytime that I would travel through, especially if I went through by car, which is my preferred method because I like to see all the places that I'm driving by, and just view all the locations that I like to visit. And I was just very afraid for the last I'm 33 years old. So for the majority of my life, I was very scary to go through and be worried about the cartel getting to me, getting to my dad. I know people that have been kidnapped by the cartel. I know people that have been, abused by the cartel. I know people who have had their farms sequestered. That was my lived experience, and I needed answers. I needed answers for why this was happening to my people, to the land. How could it be possible that my own people are hijacking the community? But then my dad said this to me, and he was like, you need to think about the cartel the way that Americans think about the Taliban. It's the same. These are a group of people that is actively being paid for by the United States, by imperial regimes, to come here and destroy the land. These are your people, but they're hijacked mentally, physically by the imperial state. Like, that is what they are. My dad's a Mexican communist, so he has a lot of problems with the United States. My grandfather was a Zapatista, so we knew what was happening. Like, we knew how things were happening, and I didn't fully come aware of it until I was an adult. But I did understand that these were not Mexican people anymore. These were American agents. And as I conceptualized that growing up, I started to really see that our land was becoming increasingly threatened by the presence of the cartel. And once I got into sociology and I understood that the reason that people join cartels is because of poverty, then I understood why the United States destabilizes Mexico. Then I understood how they manufacture the exportation of labor into the United States by destabilizing Mexico. And also the market of drug production it's incredibly lucrative. It is the most lucrative in the world. And the wealthiest people on earth are cartel. If we're talking about illegal money, that's all coming from the blood of my people. That's all coming from Mexico. That's all coming from Colombia. That's all coming from Central and South America.
Yeah, I like that you did make that comparison, to the Taliban, in the sense that I think a lot of people don't understand. So when we look at the history of Afghanistan, right? A lot of people, and this means something to me because I'm Muslim. So the what happened in Afghanistan, yes, Afghanistan had its own, socialist revolution. Cutie and I are actually working on some kind of video about that. It's in all its intricacies and all that. Anywho's, so the point is when that happened and the United States poured money and guns into this conceited effort to ignite far right-wing religious fundamental ideology, and it spread like crazy, because how are you going to get people to join that? We know as communists it is very difficult to educate people, to sometimes win people over when they're desperate, when they're hungry, especially young men. So when young men who are susceptible to right-wing ideology are suddenly presented with an alternative of, in this case, religious dogmatism, the promises of either fame and fortune in real life or in the afterlife, or however you can manipulate people, you get a lot of people who will join and fight for that cause. And then it spreads into this new narrative that all Muslims are terrorists, or all these people in Afghanistan are gonna blow people up and whatever. And it's a conceited effort to take the humanity away from people, so you don't realize that people, whether they're in Afghanistan or in Mexico or in Guatemala or in Appalachia in the United States, people are just people. Most people just want peace and something to do, but when the empire hijacks people's minds, they can create these movements and these organizations that are just absolutely detrimental to the indigenous populations. That's something I always understood with the ideas of the cartels being like, yeah, like they are American agents and what they're doing is bad, but like it's not like all these people were just born one day being like, you know what I want to be, I want to be a kingpin. Like people,
That's how I woke up.
they're looking, shut up, they're looking at the world around them and they're like, well, I gotta get my own, and unfortunately they go down a path that is not correct and manipulated by the United States.
Yeah, and so, and in terms of when Andrés Manuel López Obrador came into power, I felt the effects immediately. When I say like immediately, like literally within first few days of his term, and this is controversial, but he immediately federalized the National Guard. So he kicked out a bunch of people from the National Guard who were known to have connection to the killings of the Ayotzinapa 43, which is a whole other thing. But he kicked them out of the National Guard and anybody who had any associations with the cartel, and did like a mass like investigation, which was very controversial, especially for leftists in Mexico, because, federalizing the National Guard and like doing all this stuff. But the way that I view the National Guard, from my perception, is that it is at this point in time a necessary evil, because it is the only way to stop the cartel from coming onto our lands. My dad went and applied for a National Guard person to come and protect our land, because one of the bigger issues that people don't see that's happening in terms of the cartel and their desire to interrupt the system is that they don't just come and take the agricultural land to produce whatever it is that they're producing. They also destroy the indigenous architecture that's there. I have thousands of years of architecture that lives there, that if that land was used for agriculture, it wouldn't just destroy the ecosystem, it would cause ecocide. It would also destroy actual artifacts that have been in my family for generations. We have this mass grave site that is an indigenous grave site that has literally a ton of carvings that are, from my ancestors. If this land was expropriated for the cartel use, what it would mean is that I would not just lose the connection to the land. It would mean that the local ecosystem would be negatively impacted by its expropriation. Now, I do have an issue with the military in general, and I do have an issue with the use of legitimate violence in the context of a state and a hierarchical structure. But what I don't have an issue is sleeping at night. Like, I need my dad to be safe on the land, and that's a very controversial take in a leftist space. But from my point of view, there's no other way. My dad is not going to take arms. He's indigenous. He doesn't feel comfortable taking up arms to cause harm to other Mexican people, regardless of what their identity is, because he sees them as people who are poor, who come from poverty. Yeah. They're his own people in many ways, and so he will talk to them. He does talk to cartel members and tell them to, like, hey, like, you got to get out of this life or whatever, and try to radicalize them. But short of that, he just does not feel comfortable taking up arms. It's also, my dad's almost in his 70s. Like, he's not gonna.
Yeah. It makes sense. I don't think what you're saying is controversial. I think we honestly see a lot of, I always talk on the podcast about TikTok communists. We see a lot of TikTok communists and Twitter communists glorify violence. Oh yeah, I've been saying it a lot. If you watch the podcast, I've probably been saying it for like a year, where I'm like, TikTok communists, Anywho's, you see a lot of staunch, like, glorification of violence, and there's a difference between recognizing the necessity of when violence is going to be required to defend oneself, to defend a revolution, to defend indigenous population, and it's another thing to be obsessed with wanting to do violence. So I don't think you saying that, even though you do have general issues with, like, the concept of, like, the military or like the National Guard, doing what they have to do, it makes sense, because that's the thing, right? Like, as communists, we're going to have to make hard decisions and reconcile with things that maybe in the immediate term make sense, but in the long term will have to be reconciled with, later.
Yeah, this kind of brings me back to the video that I made a couple days ago about North Korea and the concept of a state. I think no communist is really in favor of any state or the right to use legitimate violence, but I do think that the monopoly on violence has to be hijacked by communist entities to be able to really flatten out the power structure and end borders. But for as long as borders exist and for as long as the United States exists, there has to be a counterbalancing power that can, protect populations from the United States.
Yeah. Cutie brings up a good point. There's waiting for your moment, and then there's adventurism. Exactly. 100%, and I've theoretically, in a joke in Minecraft, when I've discussed these kind of things
in Roblox,
I've said that, like, it should be quick and precise and no bucking around. You know what I mean? Like we get it done and we keep it moving.
I also think that we're not the American empire, or like we are right now, but communists are not the American empire. So I don't think that they're going to do things the same way.
Yeah. That makes sense. But yeah,
and ultimately,
so go ahead.
I was going to say, ultimately, if there is a peaceful way to accomplish any goal, that's the way you want. And the amount of violence that is acceptable is the amount of violence that's required,
right,
to make the goal happen.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I had a couple videos ago, I don't remember now. I basically said, like, yeah, we do want the monopoly of violence. Like, because it's going to be required for us to, like, as you said, hijack it in order to dismantle it. Because we can't cannot continue allow the capitalists, the compradors, the police, the military to just hold on to that. You know what I mean? So the power has to change. It has to come back to us in order for us to dismantle it. When you made a comment and said, you don't think any communist, really believes in the state. That's kind of where I've been at when it comes to, like, the fundamental disagreements, say, with, like, me and anarchists, is that I get it. I understand what you're saying, but if I only have so many years on this planet, if humans only live for so long, and only have so many years to be physically and mentally able to do the work, it makes more sense for my efforts to be focused on building a state and setting up the situation for, hopefully, the future communists who then, after time, as I mentioned this on the podcast before, as the human psyche changes, as culture changes, and then that state power can be dismantled, so people are prepared to live that way. You can't just be like, all right, guys, I know we just fought a revolution, but no state anymore, go bananas. It's just, it ain't gonna work. Well,
I also think that somebody said this in my comments when I talked a little bit about this. I think, like, saying, like, a moneyless, stateless society is like intro to communism. What we're really talking about is, like, when we're saying this, we're saying, like, long term, the goal is that borders don't exist, and so states are not required, because states, by definition, their purpose is to enforce their borders, both internally and externally. So their whole function of violence is to ensure that those borders exist, so that they're able to, as a capitalist nation, to continue to absorb the most amount of resources within its borders. And so when we think about states in that context, like, no communist fucking wants that. When we think about it in the longer term, we understand that if a state were to radically interrupt the hegemony of the United States to the point where all nations took a step towards the left, whether that is, like, far left or even minimally left, what we would see is a fall of borders. We would see the end of the state as we know it. And if we really think about it, states are relatively new phenomena. So I think it makes sense that people sort of have an allergic reaction to hearing, like, people being in favor of a North Korean state or of a Chinese state or of a Russian state or the Soviet Union, if we're being more literal. But I think that the reality is that when we're talking about states, we have to be very careful, because for people who don't have a full conceptualization of communism, we have to, like, remind them what the end goal is. And I think, like, that's where a lot of, like, communists, leftists, anarchists, etc., kind of, like, don't agree, I think a lot of anarchists have a very practical vision for the end result, but I think that a lot of hardline communists who do not want a state, I think they don't view the use of a state as something that is a reasonable application for
Mm-hmm.
for uh, for the end goal. But I do think that there's somewhere couched in between all of those ideas is the correct thing and what will ultimately be the outcome. But I do think that it's going to be whatever revolution the United States has. I think it's going to be ad hoc. So I think there's going to be many actors, and all of them are going to do different things.
Balkanization,
right. And as a result, they're going to. I do personally. I think it's coming. I don't think that the United States is going to survive much longer. In fact, like even Khaldun, you mentioned you're Muslim. I don't know if you've read even Khaldun's work. His book argues that the dynasty has a 250-year cycle, and the United States we're at 248.
I've said it before. I give the max, if I'm being super graceful, maybe another 100 years. But even then, I'm like, I'm not even sure.
I would say less. I would
like
say
I said, that's my
lifetime, top. 50. I would say 50 years max, personally, where it's like within the next 50 years, the people may still call themselves like United States citizens, but the framework and how we view the United States and what it represents, the structure of the United States I don't think will exist within it.
I understand that. And I also think too, I've mentioned this, God, I talk about this a lot. That's like one of my phrases now. That I do believe, I've mentioned, when I talk about the Third World War, like, yes, the contradictions between, the Russia, United States, China are escalating and getting bigger. But I do think when that happens, the Third World War will not only be those conflicts, but global revolutions all around the world, which I think we're sort of seeing, I feel like almost a new iteration of what it means to liberate oneself from their national oppressors, in the sense that, when the Bolsheviks did the revolution, even when the Chinese did the revolution and the Cubans, the world was still so much bigger than it is now. And it was more about, liberating ourselves within the context of the nation. But now we're at a point where, as we're seeing climate disaster get worse and worse, we're facing ultimately human extinction, in the sense of, I think some people have a misconception that like a really big hurricane will come and wipe out all the people. But really what it's going to be is a very slow stagnation of human society that will eventually just kind of dissolve human society over time, until basically there will be no real way for human civilization to continue to be sustainable in the way that we are, or at least we're trying to pretend that we are now, until eventually it just kind of peters out. And I don't want that. So, and most people in the world don't want that. So I think it's all very much going to happen, very, very, very much at the same time.
I think that's interesting. This is my cue to talk about Jill Stein. So okay. Politically, I'm very far left of her. She has a lot of ideas that I fundamentally agree with. I think a lot of her concepts are very interesting. But I want to talk about a little bit about Mexican politics, and kind of going back to the Morena Party explicitly, and what revolution is. And we define revolution as a transition from one socioeconomic structure into the next, whether that is good or bad, right? That is what revolution is by definition. It's this transition. And Mexico's transition was through electoral politics. And in fact, like in the modern age, there are many different social revolutions and economic revolutions that have happened as a result of electoral politics. And this is not me saying that electoral politics was the end all be all, particularly for Mexico. As I said, like many people died. Many people died, and they still are dying as a result of American imperialism, political corruption, just all of these other problems, particularly in Mexico, socioeconomic and otherwise, that are absolutely consequences of just the 100 years of subjugation that Mexico's endured. But I will say that the third party is a crucial element to speeding up the revolution. If we want real political change immediately, I would say that a third party would be ideal. I'm not saying that I think that a third party would win this election cycle, but I'm not delusional in that sense. But I do understand. I do understand that having a threat to the American hegemony that is very direct and clear and explicit, in the same way that the Morena Party was to the PRI and the PAN. We are in a very similar situation, by the way, as when the Morena Party came into power. It really took literally 60,000 people coming out to protest to ensure that his seat was guaranteed. So I'm not saying that it would be something that would happen this cycle, or that that it would be easy to potentially codify a third party into American politics. But I do think that there's something to be said about a third party candidate who has a real shot at disrupting the bipartisan structure. Because when people talk about revolution, we understand it as leftists as this bloody and violent disciplinary sort of reaction. But it is not true that is always the case. In fact, most revolutions are completely bloodless, and they happen at least in part through electoral politics. One of my favorite activists is Acentua at American Police Terror Project, or Anti-Police Terror Project, not American. Anti-Police Terror Project. And she said this a long time ago when I was protesting in the Black Lives Matter protests in 2016. She said, we have to throw everything at the problem, including the kitchen sink. So that means not just electoral politics, not just protests, not just actually riots, not just economic boycotts, sanctions, and divestments, not just arming yourself, not just learning how to work within the American politic. It's about also using electoral politics as an organizing tool. And we saw this directly from Malcolm X. We saw this from Martin Luther King, who asked us to use organizing. Even Angela Davis said this. I know a lot of people are mischaracterizing what she said in that interview, but she said what her words were, which were an echo of all of the other Black Panther Party members who have said similar things, which was electoral politics are an organizing tool. And what are we organizing for if we are not voting, which is fine. I don't have any issue with people who are not voting. But if we're voting within bipartisan politics, how are we organizing? How does that organize people?
Yeah.
Because I think electoral politics has a potential ability to advertise to the general public that the duopoly is not the only way to live. And I saw this happen in full scale in Mexico. We're seeing an actual literal socialist party exert its power on a national level, to the point where the response that Mexicans had to the hurricanes was infinitely better. I mean, infinitely better. 17 people died, which is terrible. But in comparison to what we now are starting to understand are the thousands of people that are dead in the southeast of the United States. So,
and just the recovery efforts are significantly better.
Oh, there were hot kitchens within hours of the hurricane ending. Hot kitchens, prepared, ready to go. People were out there. Reconstruction projects immediately. I think if people really looked to electoral politics to understand it as a tool to potentially help us, not as something that is going to change our lives overnight, or that's something that's going to help us completely, I think we would see electoral politics completely differently, especially if we saw how Mexican people applied them. And I think that's one of the biggest propaganda points that the United States has against third-party candidates. And I like Jill Stein particularly because she is especially popular. I like her message. I like that her message is appealing to even the most slack-jawed loser white guy. I think that she's really palatable. And for that reason, I think she's probably the most likely agent who could, end the duopoly in that sense, at least get the 5% vote. But and that's really the only goal, is that I think the 5% is pretty important.
Just to break it up.
So I think once that happens, even if Donald Trump got into office, even if Kamala Harris got into office, it really wouldn't matter what either of them did. They would have to move left. Doesn't matter what which one it was. They would have to move left, because it would be a direct challenge to the American empire. And I do think that potentially putting her in office would pretty much immediately put an end to a lot of really horrible things that the United States empire is doing. I also think that they would definitely try to kill her. No question.
So I've had pretty similar takes to controversial take here with the PSL and Claudia de la Cruz's campaign. Regardless of some of my own issues with PSL and other people's issues with PSL, the whole thing, it will come out when it comes out about it. But basically it's the same kind of idea. They were like, it's not necessarily, well, I guess in Jill Stein's case, Jill Stein's case, it would be about her winning. But my sort of idea with like someone like Claudia was, it's not so much about winning a federal election. It's more of like getting those members in within the confines of the states in order to, cause some kind of disruption in the ice, so to say, a fracture, because those fractures will have consequences for how the entire nation and how I don't personally like the term duopoly, but how monopoly functions, So I hear what you're saying. And going back to like the days of Lenin, the Bolsheviks believe that, you sometimes you're going to participate in elections, sometimes you're not going to, it depends. It's all strategic, do it, don't do it. But, like for me, like somebody in New York is going to go for Kamala Harris. That's how it's going to be. Right. But if someone like Claudia was on the ballot, then it would make more sense for me, a New York communist, to put favor into her as opposed to Kamala. Currently as it stands right now, with New York going to swing blue no matter what, for someone like me, there's no point in voting. My strategy goes elsewhere, as opposed to, different like swing states and such, or states that may flip one way or another. So no, you definitely have a really interesting take about that. We don't see a lot of communists brave like you to be out here and be like, well, actually, so
I know I hate to be that guy too, but I mean, the reality is that when you see the third party actually make it in another country, and you see the effects that it has, you can't help but draw the comparison. Like, I have to say, so, and this is kind of finishing up my previous point about the direct implementation of the Morena Party and what's happened in my own country. My dad has a pension now. He didn't have a pension before. I am going to be able to get a pension as a migrant, as somebody who I don't live there. I don't live there in Mexico right now. Like, I'm going to be able to enjoy a pension in the United States from the Mexican government because of my marginalization as a Mexican migrant.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. Wow.
That's pretty cool.
It's amazing. People who go to Mexico and are there as refugees are getting incredible social support. And I just, seeing in real time, also as a Mexican migrant and somebody who has lived in both countries, one of the bigger things that is most important to me is that I'm going to be able to get a house at 0% financing, or essentially what is a rent to own, at 30% of my income. That is going to change my life. That is going to change my life. After seeing the Morena Party do these things and directly apply what they said that they were going to do to Mexican politics, it made me realize, like, really, like, the actual content and the weight of potentially having a third party come into power. People think that, especially leftists think that that electoral politics is a small thing, and that it doesn't, it doesn't account for a lot, but it's everything in the kitchen sink. Everything in the kitchen sink, because we have to use every tool at our disposability to be able to do whatever it is that we can. And I just believe that we need to rage against the machine. Like every single thing, like be angry, be furious, use whatever voice you can to send your message, because these fractures that we're talking about, a third party breaking the system, that fracture is going to be leverage, and that's going to be real leverage. It's going to have consequences for both the Democratic and Republican parties. Those people are fucking rats. They are thieves. They are stealing everything from the United States and from the people who explicitly are being exploited by the government. Like what we're seeing in terms of not even just the United States, they're taking everything from countries everywhere around the world. And so we owe it to each other to view electoral politics from a practical point of view, not from a completely disillusioned and a democratic grief point of view. And I said this earlier in my live. I am not afraid of Donald Trump. I am not afraid of Kamala Harris. I do think that it's practical for people to understand and have caution about how we react to their politics and their policies in general, but we should never act with fear. We should never be afraid and constantly freeze ourselves from doing whatever it is that we need to do. But in terms of policy, the way that I have seen third-party politics apply in Mexico, and the way that I have seen social infrastructure improve for the better permanently, because they also just had the judicial reform, which was very controversial in the United States. I don't know if y'all have heard about that. Have y'all heard about that?
I heard, I didn't read full, so I don't have like full details on what was going on, but I did see a lot of news articles.
Well, Mexico's being characterized as a dictatorship now by the United States. So I don't know if y'all know this, but for the United States, for American political science, by definition, communism is dictatorship. It is literally codified within the definition of American policy. So this is because neoliberalism is literally participation in the free market and deregulation. That's by definition what neoliberalism is. And the United States is a neoliberal country. They are all even the most right-wing politician is a neoliberal. They are capitalist. And their priority is trade with other nations. Even if they're the most racist, they still want to trade with China. They still want to trade with, whatever entity they want to trade with. And whenever a country chooses not to engage in that trade, they are contextualized as a dictatorship, because they no longer are allowing the liberty of trade with the United States. So what's very interesting is that the Mexican people are being given a new power, which is in the format of the judicial reform. So the judicial reform was a 6-point plan that basically start to finish completely reformed the entire judicial branch, right? And so at the top, they have a very similar structure as the United States, which is the Supreme Court justices. And then somewhere in the middle, they have various magistrates, etc., and other local and domestic justices. And then, of course, they also have all of the administrators who live couched under the judicial branch. Well, every single one of those positions of power is, with exception of small scale administrative jobs, are all being elected by popular vote. Can you imagine if the United States elected the Supreme Court justices by popular vote and the implications that it would have for American policy?
I mean, it would change everything.
It would change everything.
Complete fundamental change of everything.
And they can't be reelected. They can only be couched in their position for, I think, a total of, it was either 6 or 10 years. They have a very short term limit, and they can't be reelected. They have to stay in their position for that period of time, and they can't come back. They can't reapply. They can't. Which limits the power of the Supreme Court and the justices within the program. One of the bigger issues that the left has with the judicial reform is that they are now going to be delivering, certain justices are going to be delivering their courts with anonymity because of the cartels in particular, which some leftists are like, okay, that could be a violation of human rights. 6 years, a 7-year term?
6. It's 6
years. 6 year term. Yeah, so they have a very limited term now that they can't reapply for. And so actually, is that true that they can't reapply? Actually, that might not be true. They might be able to now reapply. I don't remember if that was what changed.
So it says here, the members of the JDT will be elected by popular vote and serve a 6-year term with no possibility of reelection.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. So the justice reform makes it so that they can't reapply. So in any case, it's a complete overhaul of the justice system. And as a result, the Mexican public is going to have the ability to codify it into law, whatever they want, really. And the United States had a massive tantrum when this happened. I mean, the propaganda that was churned out, they said that they were emasculating the Supreme Court. They referred to Mexico as a backsliding democracy. It's just the level, because the Supreme Court also supports Congress to some degree in making sure that the trade agreements are nationalized or not. So like if there's agriculture that is better for Mexico, then Congress the legislative branch and the judicial branch collaborate to make sure that whether or not that gets administrated federally, or if it actually those resources can be traded on. So there's just a heavy interest of the United States for that to have not happened. And the trials, of course, of criminals of the United States are also going to be affected by this. So there's just a lot there that the United States is fundamentally opposed to. So, and this is directly couched under the Morena Party. This was one of the biggest reforms that was explicitly done by this third party. This is why I'm like drinking the third party juice, because I've truly seen the change. And I know that that's controversial for leftists to advocate and go so hard for a third party potentially coming to power. But I've seen the solution. I've seen it happen.
Yeah. No, I mean, honestly, this whole conversation actually has been very, very helpful. I do appreciate you coming on. You know, we've been going at this for a little over an hour now. Is there anything else you want to say real quick? What the plan is real quick, because of the breaking news, we're gonna change gears a little bit and touch on the news that just came out. You can stay for that if you want. We can drop you down. It's up to you. But breaking is there anything news sort of on this topic?
It's major news going on right now.
Yeah. So I'll she's like, what happened? Yeah. This is like a collective first time change gears middle of the shift. But anywho's, is there anything you want to say like in finality about this topic that you brought up to us?
Yeah, I mean, the last thing that I think I want to say is, no matter what your beliefs are, never succumb to democratic grief to keep you from moving. And always remember that whatever the United States thinks, whatever the general message that the United States puts out about any country, it's probably the opposite is true. Yeah, so that's probably my biggest contribution, I think, to this conversation, is that we have other places to look to view revolution from different points of view, and we have neighbors that are our comrades and are doing very, very impressive things that will change the world. Yeah, I just saw the news.
Okay. Do you want
I'm a political science student, so I'm scared.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
There's one last little thing I wanted to say, because the conversation reminded me of a quote that I heard a long time ago, and it comes from the Mexican Revolution back in 1919. It under Zapata, it wasn't Zapata himself, but someone else. I don't know what socialism is, but I am a Bolshevik. And that's sort of touching on what you were talking about earlier, where it's like, you know, they're not calling themselves communists, they're not calling themselves socialists necessarily, but in all but name, that's effectively what's happening.
You got some nice.
Can I stay for while you talk about the news?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, right. I have some opinions.
No, you're good. You got some compliments here. He said, "Thanks, Oma. I appreciate everything you said. Learned a lot." And from Chico, agree. I learned a lot. It was great.
Thank you. I'm so glad y'all.
All right, cool. So, in morbid news, as we were discussing, you know, the hypothetical war. So this happened. So, live updates: Israel strikes at Iran targets in retaliation for earlier attack. Now, if I'm not mistaken, gang, Israel hasn't blatantly attacked Iran, like Iran proper, right? Since October 7th? Like,
not that they have claimed. It's as far as I know, it's like highly suspected that something was them, but not like they said yes.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go from, sorry, it's Bourgeois News, MPC News. Wow. Well, I'm going to call it that. Israel confirmed that it has launched precise strikes on military targets in Iran. Early Saturday local time, Israeli occupational forces said the strikes were in response to months of continuous attack. What do you mean? Oh,
I'm on CNN. I'm looking at the CNN live updates right now. And as of 1 minute ago, Israel is currently carrying out a second wave.
Great.
Like quite literally as we're talking about this, a second wave is hitting.
The strikes appear limited to military sites, non-Iranian nuclear facilities, or oil fields. Strikes today came as Israel intensified its campaigns in Gaza and Lebanon. Here we go. Let me refresh this page, see where we're at. Israel's retaliation in Iran makes the emergence of escalating decades-long shadow war. The strikes mark the first time Israel has led an attack on Iranian soil. Iran, which primarily relies on Soviet-era tech, does not match Israel's weapon sophistication. I like how they say that, but then Iran bombed the fuck out of Tel Aviv like 4 weeks ago. So, is it Soviet-era tech, or is it just like what do you mean by that, dog? But that's the propaganda, how it starts. 2 defense officials tell NBC News the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin spoke with Israel counterparts. All right, Goober, let's go here. Page change. Let me make sure. Nope, I have to manually change it. Bear with me. One quick. Live update. Israel launches airstrike against Iran in retaliatory attack. Here's the latest developments. They're behind, Cruz. If you can send me that link from the CNN.
Yeah, I got
Israeli military said early Saturday that it began striking Iran in response to several Iranian attacks on Israel, raising fears. Long brewing confrontation between 2 of the most powerful militaries in the West Asia could escalate into all-out war. Geez Louise. What is our students of the political science? Can you tell those who might not be in the know, what is Israel trying to gain from this? A situation that they know it will more than likely escalate.
I think there's a common misconception about politics from the left and from the right the same, which is that people believe that politicians fundamentally do not believe what they're saying and that they're being disingenuous in their actions. But actually, so something that I like to always bring to the conversation is that when it comes to political science is entirely, okay, I say this as a political science student, it's entirely propaganda. It is predicated upon the function of colonialism at its core. The American polity as an umbrella is fully indoctrinating. So these politicians, Kamala Harris, when people are like, oh, she's being so disingenuous, why is she supporting Israel the way that she's being genuine. She actually believes what she's saying. Even if she understands that this is a genocide, she believes that Israel is more important, that Jewish lives are more important than the lives of Palestinian people. That is truly what she believes. And I think that is a common misconception. The second thing that I also like to remind people of is that the United States is a child. It is a totally new society in comparison to the rest of the world. The Middle East is one of the oldest societies that has ever existed. In fact, North Africa is literally one of the oldest societies that has ever existed. Iran is an incredibly old people. Their reactions have been nothing but measured. This is still even like this attack that Israel is doing on Iran right now is nothing short of a childish response to the Iranian strength. People also don't always remember, but there are only 6 nuclear superpowers. Iran is one of them. So from my point of view, when we like my initial reaction is I'm scared because of the United States. I'm not afraid of Iran. Iran has been nothing but wise the entirety of this conflict. Like if we really think about it, and I have a lot of problems with the Iranian regime. I have a lot of problems with the Iranian government. I fundamentally oppose their religious police and like the way that they treat the women, etc. Blah blah. Fine, but that aside, Iran is still an older society that has implications for the United States. So one of my takes on the politics of the situation is that Iran is going to continue to be very measured and deliberate in its response. And this is actually the second time that Israel has attacked Iran. And the last time they keep saying this, that they want to have these symbolic strikes on Iran. And the reason they're doing this is because they're embarrassed. They are a failing empire. My dad says this all the time, Israel is a society of very few people. It's a very small country. And they are actively trying to protect the capitalist interests of the American government. That's really what they are. They are an arm of the American empire. So in my opinion, we have nothing to fear from Iran, but we do have a lot to fear from the state's oppression. And one of the reasons that I believe that this is happening the way that it is because Kamala Harris is trying to come across as strong, and she is being spoon-fed a lot of ideas about her positions, so that way she continues the genocide in Palestine. So, if we understand that she fully believes the shit that she's saying, if we understand it that way, then we can sort of see that this is going to be a display of strength. This is something that she thinks is a display of strength, because American politicians heavily prioritize high dominant style of leadership. If you see like how Trump is in particular, they like to display strength as a way to identify their American identity as politicians. So
I just thank you for that analysis. Really, really good. I pulled some pictures from Telegram. So this is from Tehran from a couple of minutes ago. Just somebody's cell phone picture, something on fire, burning, obviously.
Do we know what they attacked?
We haven't gotten confirmation of anything.
So
yet.
What I'm seeing at least on the CNN one, it's military targets, like military targets as in quotes.
Well, that's the first time that Israel's been measured in any country.
And you know what?
Well, who knows? Like they say a military target would be, an apartment building and it's got a missile silo in the bottom of it or something, So
right, or has a radio antenna, or it's a preschool,
Yeah, it could be a preschool, according to them.
100%. I got one more. Unfortunately, one of the first people to post about it. This is not. I'm not condoning them. I don't care for Jackson Hinkle. But he's way too excited about this. Of course he is. But yeah, this is two of the same photos that he got from Instagram, which I wish I realized that before I downloaded it. But yeah, so that's what we have. That's where we're at. I keep refreshing this page to see if there's anything news coming out, but there's really not going to be anything probably for the next couple of minutes. So to those of you who are in the audience right now, if it continues to build and build and build, I will go live again and we can talk about this. But for now, I just wanted to touch base with you guys about that. That's what's going on. Oh my, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun. Listen, don't correct me, dog.
I'm gonna.
Yeah, it's and May, like the month. May.
May. Well,
but anyway, I will correct you. Yeah. I'm just letting you know.
The final update I'm seeing here before we go. Both Iran and Israel have closed their airspaces. So we'll see what transpires as a result of that.
Okay. Anyway, stick around after the show for a few minutes, and to the rest of you lovelies, goodbye.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely great.